It started with one tow truck and ended with a neighborhood war. When an entitled HOA Karen parked in the wrong driveway, she unleashed a battle that shook the entire community. One man's driveway, one neighbor's arrogance, and a single tow that set off weeks of chaos, police calls, and HOA drama no one could have imagined. She thought his driveway was free parking. He thought it was time for a tow. Neither expected the entire block to grab popcorn and watch the drama unfold. When entitlement meets patience, there's only one winner. This is the story of how a quiet homeowner stood up to a Karen and won back his driveway. One tow at a time. Every neighborhood has rules. Every street has its drama. But when one Karen pushed too far, her SUV became the star of the most talked about showdown in town. The first tow in a quiet suburban neighborhood lined with identical two-story houses. Order was supposed to reign supreme. The lawns were trimmed to regulation height. Fences were painted a uniform shade of beige and every mailbox matched. But beneath the manicured appearance, conflict brewed. It wasn't about the shape of hedges or the color of a garage door this time. Instead, the entire neighborhood's fragile balance was about to be shaken by one woman's arrogance and her refusal to respect even the most basic boundary, a man's driveway. The homeowner in question was a black man named Marcus. He had worked hard for years to buy his home, a corner lot with a long, private driveway that led up to a spotless garage. For him, this house represented success, security, and a personal victory over all the obstacles life had thrown in his path. But to his neighbor, an entitled woman often described behind closed doors as the HOA Karen, his driveway looked more like a free parking spot. From the very beginning, Karen had carried herself with an air of superiority. She hovered at HOA meetings, ready to lecture anyone who didn't mow their lawn on time. And she reported neighbors for having trash bins visible for more than an hour. She believed her position as an unofficial enforcer of neighborhood rules gave her authority over everyone. But the irony was hard to miss. While she obsessed over others, she never held herself accountable. The first time Marcus noticed her car in his driveway, he assumed it was a mistake. The sleek SUV sat crookedly near his garage door, as if it belonged there. He checked to make sure he hadn't accidentally given permission or overlooked some arrangement. But no, he had never invited anyone to use his driveway, least of all the one neighbor who treated everyone else as though they lived under her rule. He decided to let it go the first time. Perhaps she had a guest over, or her driveway was blocked for some reason. But when it happened again, and then again, it became impossible to ignore. Every time he came home from work, there it was, Karen's SUV sitting smugly in his space, as though it had been claimed. She never knocked on his door to ask permission. She never offered an explanation. She simply parked there as if it were her right. Marcus knew he couldn't let this pattern continue. He had tried leaving polite reminders, notes folded neatly under her windshield wiper, but the messages disappeared and the car kept returning. Finally, after yet another day of coming home to find his own driveway blocked, he made a decision. He would call for a tow. The tow truck arrived in the late afternoon, its flashing amber lights reflecting off the manicured lawns and spotless windows of the neighborhood. Slowly, carefully, the operator hitched Karen's SUV to the truck. Neighbors peeked from their windows, their curiosity rising as the scene unfolded. The vehicle was hauled away, leaving behind nothing but a patch of flattened grass where its tires had pressed. When Karen returned to find her driveway empty, her reaction could be heard halfway down the block. Her voice rose in angry bursts, each word sharper than the last, as she realized what had happened. She stormed toward Marcus's house, gesturing wildly and demanding answers. But Marcus refused to engage. He stood calm, collected, knowing that the law and the deed to his property was on his side. The incident became the talk of the neighborhood. Some whispered that Marcus had overreacted, but most agreed he had been more than patient. After all, his driveway was his private property, not community space. And while Karen tried to paint herself as the victim, her history of entitlement made her protests fall flat. Yet instead of learning her lesson, instead of recognizing that her actions carried consequences, Karen's anger only deepened. To her, The tow wasn't a warning, it was a challenge, and she was determined to win, no matter how much humiliation or inconvenience she faced along the way. This was just the beginning. The first tow was not the end of the battle, but the opening shot. In what would become a neighborhood spectacle, Marcus didn't yet realize how stubborn Karen could be, and Karen didn't realize how prepared Marcus was to defend what was his. Their clash would spiral far beyond a single towing, pulling in neighbors, police officers, and even the HOA board itself. As dusk settled over the suburban streets, the air buzzed with the kind of tension that only grows when pride and entitlement collide. Both sides believed they had drawn their line in the sand. Both sides thought the other would back down. But in reality, neither was willing to surrender. The war over a single driveway had only just begun. Karen strikes. That morning, after her SUV had been hauled away, Karen emerged from her house with a storm in her eyes. Neighbors watched from behind curtains and across porches, sensing that she was not about to let the incident slide. Her reputation as the self-proclaimed watchdog of the HOA meant she had to save face. To her, Marcus's decision to tow her vehicle wasn't just about a driveway, it was an attack on her authority, a challenge to her self-imposed role as ruler of the cul-de-sac. She marched straight into the HOA office that afternoon, slamming her complaint down with a flair for drama. She painted Marcus as hostile, unreasonable, and disruptive to the community's friendly spirit. She insisted that her use of his driveway was harmless, temporary, and even beneficial since it prevented other, less desirable cars from cluttering the neighborhood. Her words dripped with entitlement, and though the HOA board members listened politely, many of them exchanged knowing glances. They had dealt with Karen's theatrics before. Still, the board couldn't completely ignore her. To avoid being accused of favoritism, they sent a letter to Marcus asking for a clarification on the situation. It was written in stiff, formal language, suggesting that the use of his driveway might be seen as a neighborly accommodation rather than a violation. Marcus read the letter twice, his frustration building. He realized that Karen's influence, even if shallow, was enough to cause him more headaches than he deserved. But Marcus wasn't the type to back down. He responded in writing, attaching a copy of his property deed and referencing state law about private property rights. He made it clear that his driveway was off-limits permanently, and that trespassing vehicles would continue to be towed without further warning. His response was precise, calm, and backed by undeniable evidence. When Karen received word of Marcus's refusal to bend, her rage ignited again. That evening, she returned home and deliberately parked her SUV across his driveway, blocking it entirely. This was no accident. It was an open declaration of war. The sight of her vehicle sitting there, smugly positioned as if daring Marcus to act, sent whispers rippling down the block. Marcus didn't hesitate. With quiet determination, he placed another call to the towing company. Within the hour, the truck's amber lights lit up the street once more. The operator, who had already grown familiar with the situation, hooked the SUV and pulled it away. The neighbors who had gathered couldn't help but chuckle at the unfolding drama. Karen's defiance had once again backfired when she returned, to find her SUV missing for the second time in less than a week. Her screams pierced the calm night air. She stomped up and down the street, ranting about injustice, racism, and harassment. She accused Marcus of targeting her unfairly, spinning the narrative to make herself appear as the victim of some cruel vendetta. But those who had witnessed her parking across Marcus's driveway knew the truth. The second tow made it clear to everyone Karen was willing to escalate, even if it made her look foolish, and Marcus, calm and calculated, was equally committed to defending his rights. It was a clash of pride, fueled by entitlement on one side and principle on the other. Neither showed signs of backing down. The HOA board, once again dragged into the mess, found itself under pressure. Karen demanded they punish Marcus for harassment, while Marcus insisted that they enforce the rules equally. The board members, caught in the middle, began to realize that the situation was spiraling beyond their control. By now, the entire neighborhood was invested in the drama. Some rooted for Marcus, admiring his calm resolve. Others feared Karen's wrath and whispered that she might not stop until she got what she wanted. The tension grew heavier with each passing day, and everyone waited to see what would happen next. The battle lines had been drawn deeper. What had started as a single tow had become a power struggle with no easy resolution. And as the second tow truck disappeared into the night, taking Karen's SUV with it, the stage was set for an even greater confrontation. The HOA joins the fight. By the time Karen's SUV had been towed for the second time, the entire neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Everyone had an opinion, whispered over fences and muttered at community meetings. But one thing was certain: the feud had grown too large for the HOA board to ignore. The board had been designed to maintain order, trimmed hedges, quiet evenings, matching exteriors, not to referee a full-scale battle between neighbors. Yet Karen stormed into their office with such force that the board president privately joked she might tear the door off its hinges. She ranted for nearly an hour, painting Marcus as a bully and herself as a poor, mistreated resident who had been unfairly targeted. Though the board members knew Karen's history of complaints, her persistence wore them down. She demanded that the HOA intervene and prevent Marcus from calling tow trucks. She argued that her parking in his driveway was justified, citing community spirit and emergency overflow as flimsy excuses. Marcus, in contrast, approached the board calmly, with documentation in hand. He presented photographs of her SUV blocking his garage, copies of his property deed, and even screenshots of state statutes supporting his right to tow trespassing vehicles. His approach was steady, professional, and impossible to dismiss. The board, caught between two completely different temperaments, tried to mediate. They called a special meeting and invited both parties. Neighbors filled the chairs, eager for a front row seat to the unfolding drama. Karen took the floor first, her voice rising in pitch as she spun tales of harassment, discrimination, and abuse. But as she rambled, her credibility unraveled. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves, clearly skeptical. When it was Marcus's turn, he spoke with quiet authority. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult. He simply stated the facts. Karen had parked in his driveway repeatedly, without permission, and had been warned multiple times. The audience listened closely, nodding along as his evidence spoke, louder than Karen's theatrics. Despite the clear imbalance in credibility, the board was reluctant to take a firm stand. They didn't want to anger Karen, who was notorious for filing endless complaints and dragging out disputes. So they issued a weak compromise. Marcus could continue towing vehicles that trespassed on his driveway, but they urged neighborly communication to avoid future conflict. The decision infuriated Karen. To her, it was a betrayal by the very organization she believed she controlled. She left the meeting seething, her face red with rage, muttering about how the HOA board was filled with incompetence and traitors. But Marcus knew better. He had learned that Karen wasn't one to let things go. She thrived on conflict, and now she was cornered. And when people like her feel cornered, they don't retreat, they lash out. Sure enough, the very next day, Karen escalated once again. Instead of using her own driveway, she parked her SUV squarely in Marcus's, this time closer to his garage than ever before, blocking him completely. It was her boldest move yet, a brazen act of defiance meant to provoke him into a mistake. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply picked up the phone, called the same towing company, and watched as the operator, who now knew the situation all too well, hauled the SUV away. For a third time, the neighborhood erupted. People came out of their houses to witness the spectacle, some laughing openly while others shook their heads. Karen's stubbornness had become entertainment, her SUV vanishing down the street once again under the tow truck's chain. But the laughter faded quickly. Everyone knew that Karen wouldn't accept defeat quietly, and after 3 humiliating tows, her next move promised to be louder, messier, and more public than anything so far. The neighborhood had become a stage, and every resident was an unwilling audience. The fight between Marcus and Karen was no longer just about a driveway. It was about dominance, pride, and the unraveling order of a community that had once seemed picture perfect. And with tensions rising higher than ever, Marcus began to wonder, how many more times would Karen push before things spiraled completely out of control? Karen calls the police beat the time Karen's SUV had been towed for the third time. Her humiliation was complete. Neighbors chuckled behind her back, whispering about how stubborn she was, how ridiculous she looked, and how Marcus had outsmarted her at every turn. For someone who thrived on control, the laughter was unbearable. To Karen, it wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about respect, about dominance, about proving she couldn't be pushed around. That night, Karen paced her living room, fury boiling over into a plan. If the HOA wouldn't protect her, and if the tows kept piling up, then she would call in reinforcements. She convinced herself that Marcus wasn't simply defending his property, he was targeting her, discriminating against her, and intentionally humiliating her in front of the neighborhood. Whether she believed her own lies or just used them as an excuse didn't matter. In her mind, the solution was simple. She would call the police. The next morning, Karen's SUV appeared in Marcus's driveway once again. This time, however, she stayed home, watching from her front window with her phone already in hand. She was baiting him, setting a trap. The moment Marcus picked up the phone to call the towing company, she dialed 911, her voice frantic and high-pitched, as she claimed she was being harassed by her neighbor. When the tow truck arrived, its amber lights flashing, so did two police cruisers. The quiet cul-de-sac erupted into chaos as officers stepped out, their presence drawing neighbors to their porches and windows. Karen rushed to meet them, gesturing wildly toward Marcus, shouting about harassment, theft, and discrimination. She pointed to the tow truck operator as if he were an accomplice in some grand conspiracy. Marcus, calm as ever, greeted the officers with documents in hand. He explained the situation, showing them his property deed, the HOA's weak compromise letter, and even the state statutes that protected his right to tow vehicles trespassing on his property. The officers listened carefully, their expressions shifting from suspicion to understanding as Marcus laid out the facts. Then they turned to Karen. Her story unraveled quickly under questioning. She admitted she had parked in Marcus's driveway without permission. She admitted she had done it multiple times. She even admitted she had ignored his notes and warnings. Her excuses about emergency overflow, about community spirit, sounded hollow against the weight of the evidence. The officers made it clear Marcus was within his rights. Karen was trespassing. If she continued, she could face fines or even charges. Her face burned crimson as the words sank in, her plan backfiring. In front of the very audience she hoped to sway, neighbors whispered louder now, some shaking their heads, others openly smirking. The drama had reached a new level, and everyone was watching Karen's downfall play out in real time. But Karen wasn't done. Humiliated by the officer's verdict, she doubled down once more. As the tow truck pulled her SUV away for the fourth time, she screamed accusations into the air about unfair treatment, about racism, about how the entire neighborhood was conspiring against her. Her words grew more desperate, less believable, until even the officers turned away. Weary of her theatrics. Marcus, meanwhile, stood silently on his porch, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. He had proven his point again, not with anger but with patience and facts. The officers left, the tow truck rolled away, and the cul-de-sac slowly quieted. But beneath the silence, a deeper tension settled. Karen had played her boldest card and lost. She had called in the authorities and still come up empty-handed. Yet everyone knew she wasn't the type to admit defeat. If anything, her humiliation would drive her to find new ways to lash out. The neighborhood braced itself. The war over one man's driveway had now become a spectacle of stubbornness, pride, and obsession, and while Marcus held the high ground, Karen's unpredictable rage made her more dangerous than ever. The battle was far from over. The neighborhood takes sides after the fourth tow and the failed attempt to weaponize the police. Karen's reputation in the neighborhood reached a breaking point. What had once been mild annoyance with her constant nitpicking at HOA meetings transformed into open disdain. Neighbors no longer whispered cautiously about her, they spoke freely, mocking her stubbornness and laughing at the sight of her SUV disappearing on the back of a tow truck. But while many saw Marcus as a quiet hero who stood up against entitlement, not everyone was on his side. A handful of neighbors, either intimidated by Karen or sympathetic to her claims of harassment, began to echo her narrative. They grumbled that Marcus was escalating the situation by towing her car instead of being the bigger person. They argued that calling a tow truck for times was excessive, even if he was in the right. Lines began to form. On one side were those who admired Marcus's calm persistence and his refusal to let anyone trample on his rights. They saw Karen's behavior for what it was, an endless display of entitlement, disrespect, and manipulation. On the other side were Karen's loyal defenders, few though they were, who bought into her sob story or simply feared being targeted themselves. The HOA board, stuck in the middle, scrambled to maintain order. They scheduled another emergency meeting, one that drew nearly the entire neighborhood. The atmosphere was tense, every seat filled, with whispers filling the air before the session began. The board members tried to project authority, but their nervous glances revealed how little control they had left. Karen arrived dramatically, armed with a stack of papers she claimed were evidence of harassment and discrimination. She launched into another tirade, her voice echoing through the community hall as she painted Marcus as a villain out to destroy her life. But the murmurs in the crowd told a different story. Her words no longer carried the weight they once did. When Marcus spoke, the contrast was striking. He presented his case methodically, laying out the timeline of events, showing proof of notes left on Karen's windshield, copies of HOA correspondence, and even police reports from the day officers had been called. He never raised his voice, never insulted her, and never strayed from the facts. The calmness of his presentation only highlighted the chaos of hers. By the end of the meeting, the division was clear. The majority sided with Marcus, applauding his restraint and his patience in the face of Karen's outrageous behavior. A smaller but vocal minority sided with Karen, muttering about neighborhood unity and claiming Marcus was too rigid. The rift spilled out beyond the meeting. Some neighbors began avoiding Karen altogether, crossing the street rather than risk an encounter. Others openly confronted her, telling her to leave Marcus alone. The once pristine community, built on the illusion of order and harmony, now seethed with tension. For Marcus, the support was comforting, but also exhausting. He hadn't asked to be a neighborhood symbol. He only wanted peace, his driveway free from entitlement, his home a sanctuary rather than a battleground. But as long as Karen refused to back down, peace remained out of reach. Karen, meanwhile, stood in her house, furious at being laughed at and dismissed. Every glance from a neighbor felt like betrayal, every whisper confirmation that her power was slipping away. She was isolated, mocked, and humiliated, but she still wasn't ready to surrender. As the neighborhood fracture deepened, everyone braced for what came next. Karen was cornered, her influence dwindling, her pride wounded beyond repair. And when someone like her feels cornered, they don't back down. They lash out harder, louder, and more recklessly. The battle for the driveway had become a battle for the soul of the neighborhood. And with one final clash looming, no one knew just how far Karen would go. The final straw by the time the fifth week rolled around. The neighborhood was weary. What had begun as a petty dispute over a driveway had ballooned into a full-blown spectacle. Neighbors whispered less now, not because they'd lost interest, but because the drama had become so heavy, so consuming, that it hung in the air like a storm cloud. Everyone knew it couldn't last much longer. Something had to give. Karen, however, refused to see it that way. Every humiliation only hardened her resolve. The tows, the police involvement, the laughter of her neighbors, each one was, in her mind, an injustice that demanded retaliation. She told herself she wasn't just fighting for a driveway. She was fighting for respect, for recognition, for her place as the unchallenged figure of authority in the neighborhood. Pride was her fuel, and by now it had burned so hot that reason could no longer cool it. Late one Friday evening, she made her boldest move yet. She pulled her SUV into Marcus's driveway once again, this time edging it dangerously close to his garage door, almost as if daring him to try and tow it. But she didn't stop there. She set up a lawn chair on her own property, positioned perfectly so she could watch his every move. She sat there with her arms crossed, her eyes locked on Marcus's front door, waiting. When Marcus came home and saw the SUV blocking his garage yet again, he sighed. More tired than angry. He knew exactly what Karen was doing. She wanted a reaction, something she could twist into her advantage. But Marcus wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Calmly, he called the tow company one last time. The rumble of the tow truck engine echoed through the cul-de-sac, and as the amber lights flickered in the dark, neighbors emerged from their homes. Sensing that the end was near, they lined the sidewalks, arms folded, whispering among themselves. The atmosphere was electric, like an audience waiting for the final act of a long, exhausting play. Karen exploded the moment the truck backed into position. She leapt from her chair, screaming at the operator, accusing him of theft, corruption, and conspiracy. She hurled insults at Marcus, who stood silently on his porch, arms crossed, refusing to be baited. The operator, unfazed, continued hooking up the SUV, his face calm from dealing with worse scenes before. Then the police arrived again, called this time by several concerned neighbors, who feared the shouting would spiral out of control. But the officers didn't need much convincing. They had seen this all before. Marcus handed them the same documents, the same proof, and once again, the law was clear. The SUV was trespassing. The tow was legal. Karen's face twisted with disbelief as the officers turned to her, warning her that if she continued, she could face real consequences, fines, charges, even legal action from Marcus for harassment. The crowd of neighbors watched silently, many of them nodding in approval, others shaking their heads in disbelief that it had come to this. The SUV was lifted onto the tow truck, its tires leaving grooves in Marcus's driveway. Karen screamed until her voice cracked, but the sight of her vehicle disappearing into the night for the fourth and final time silenced her. She stood in the middle of the street, trembling with rage and humiliation, while the neighborhood watched in stunned quiet. The next morning, her house looked different. Curtains stayed drawn, the driveway empty. For the first time in years, Karen skipped the HOA meeting. The neighborhood, once fractured by her influence, began to heal. Conversation shifted back to mundane things: yard sales, lawn care, block parties. The drama that had consumed them finally started to fade. As for Marcus, he returned to his life of quiet dignity. His driveway remained empty except for his own car, the way it should have been all along. He hadn't wanted to be a symbol of resistance, hadn't asked for the spotlight, but through patience, persistence, and calm resolve, he had stood his ground against entitlement and won. Karen's presence never fully disappeared. She remained in her house, quieter now, diminished. Some said she had learned her lesson. Others whispered she was simply plotting her next crusade. But one thing was certain: she would never again dare to park in Marcus's driveway. The battle was over. The neighborhood had witnessed the rise and fall of entitlement, played out in the most ordinary of places, a driveway. And as the sun set on another quiet evening, the community exhaled, grateful that peace, at least for now, had finally returned.